one possibility out of that. All right,
Sounds
Ron,
good.
you can.
About that time. Well, welcome everyone to our third episode of Creativity in Crisis. I'm Ron Baguetta with my co-host Yang Zhao. We're going to be talking today about the big question, which we probably cannot cover adequately in one episode. Can creativity be taught? And so we are pleased to be joined by Michael Anderson and Jody Ritchie, and we'll have each of our guests introduce themselves, and then we'll dive into our topic. And as usual, we've polled folks out there in social media and have some responses on a couple questions. So we'll use those as stimuli to kind of generate our conversation and serve as provocations for our thinking. So we hope to push each other's thoughts and your own thoughts, those of you that are watching live or watching asynchronously. So who would like to jump in and introduce themselves?
I'll start. Hi, everybody. I'm Jody Ritchie, and I'm so honored and pleased to be here with all of you today and to talk about a topic that's near and dear to my heart, which is creativity. And I currently am the Performing Arts Chair at Hawkins School, which is in Gates Mills, Ohio, right outside of Cleveland. And I've been a teacher for 26 years. I've had the opportunity to work with students across the whole spectrum, from preschool 3-year-olds in the music classroom to undergraduate music majors at the collegiate level. And so I'm very excited to be here and to talk a little bit about the work that we're doing at Hawkins to really address this big puzzle of creativity in education. And I'm excited to learn with all of you and to push my own thinking so we can continue to really unpack what this means for our students and for their future. So thank you both for having me here today.
Thanks, Jody.
Thanks, Jody. My name is Professor Michael Anderson. I'm from the University of Sydney. I'm Professor of Arts and Creativity Education at the University of Sydney, and I'm co-director of the Create Centre, which is looking at transformation in education through creativity and the arts. And I'm also co-founder of 4C Transformative Learning, which works in 50 schools in long-term partnerships for transformation. So looking at how you actually kind of do creativity in reality rather than rhetorically. So hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about some of that work as well.
Great, thank you, Michael. So I'm going to share this screen with our first question as kind of a way to launch us into this conversation. And this is something that Young sent out. And so as of earlier this morning, these are our results. I don't know if they've changed some, but our very first question is, can creativity be taught? And so we see the vast majority of respondents saying yes, with a little bit of ambivalence with maybe, and then a smaller slice saying no. So Jody, Michael, Young, and then I'll respond as well. What are your thoughts when you see this kind of response, and how does it align with the way you think about this question of can creativity be taught?
Go for it, Judy. You can get started.
Thank you. I'm excited to see that there's more people out there that are thinking, yes, it can be taught. But the disclaimer for me is it really depends on what you mean by creativity. And creativity, I found in my own work, means different things to different people. So we really need to start by asking the question, what do we mean by creativity? And for me, that's the distributed and participatory development of ideas over time. And I think more about creativity as a process. And I think as an educator, I have a real desire and hope that we can continue to sharpen our lens on what does this mean? How are we defining creativity and our beliefs about creativity, and what does that mean for our students? And then I just want to add that for me, I often think about not the question of can we teach creativity, but more how might we restore creativity for all of our students, and a hope that every student is invited to the table, and every student that we encounter in education believes that they belong at the creativity table. So I believe educators can activate, they can nurture creativity, but I also will say that I'm in the small percentage of people out there that believes, no, I don't think you can teach it, because I believe everyone already has it, and it's a part of our humanity.
Well, restore creativity. Michael, what do you think?
Just kind of bouncing off what Jody's saying, kind of point of disagreement, and I know you're after a little bit of disagreement, Yong. So I actually think we can teach creativity, and we must. I completely agree it's an inherency, but we've got inherencies in all kinds of things. We've got things that we're born with that we need to develop, and creativity is one of those things that we need to develop, that we need to get stronger at. So if you asked any playwright or any dancer, you've obviously been born with these physical and kind of cognitive skills, but do you want to develop them? Do you want to take them further? They're going to say, of course I do. Of course I want to develop them. And I think that's true of our young people as well. We need to be able to give our young people kind of a coherent understanding of what creativity is. And we need our teachers to have a coherent pedagogy for creativity. And in that response, I think what we're seeing is a real frustration in my mind. Of course we want to teach creativity, but how do we actually do it? Where are the coherent structures? Where's the professional learning? Where are the ways that we can get our head around it? And I kind of want to say that our systems have let us down. Our education systems, on the one hand, like UNESCO, like education systems all around the world, have said we must teach creativity, which I agree with. And then the how is completely missing. It's nowhere. I mean, I could talk a little bit later about where those structures are.
But Michael, so I'm actually with Judy. I have written in my book years ago, I said creativity cannot be taught, but it can be killed. So that's my line. You can kill creativity, but you cannot teach creativity. So my argument is that it's very much like Judy to say, we are born with the capacity to create. We're born with the desire to create. But then once we create, then we learn not to create. We learn and we're taught not to create. And therefore we kill creativity. But in that sense, my view is that creativity is a natural born capacity. It's a natural born thing. We have to do that. So I was just wondering, Ron, what do you think? You're the, from your research angle, what's the thing?
Well, I love that we're having some points of disagreement already. I agree. I'll start with my agreement. I agree that creativity is one of those things that we all have the capacity to do and do every day without even naming it, right? So maybe it's more about being more intentional with our creativity. So creativity is not like reading where you actually have to be taught how to read, right? So I agree with that. I completely disagree that you can kill creativity. As long as there's life, there's creativity. I mean, you can stifle it. You can create conditions whereby it is so miserable to try to think and act in different ways and so punitive that people aren't going to take that risk. But as long as there's life, there's creativity, and there's folks that even in the most dire situations will resist terrible pedagogy, terrible constraints, and be creative doing so. So I love that we get to disagree about that. Let me just throw this out there. So I love that Jody started out by saying, what do we mean by creativity? I would also say, what do we mean by teaching creativity, right? So I've written this little piece that talks about, okay, so you can teach about creativity, which has value, because I think that helps people get a grounding on what do we even mean by this and what does that look like. I think you can teach with creativity or creatively, so teachers can express themselves creatively, and I think sometimes they don't, right? I think sometimes we all that are educators are our own greatest barriers to creativity. And then I think you can teach for creativity. It's not about teaching people how to be creative or give them creativity, but it is kind of activating, as Jody said as well. Creating conditions whereby students have an opportunity and are actually supported in trying to think and act in different ways, which is kind of a big ask, particularly the way schools are structured now, where it's really about doing what's expected and how it's expected. That's how you're successful in school. And that goes for teachers and administrators and so on. So I'll just throw that out there and see kind of where that leads us.
Let me jump back at you guys. By the way, Judy and Michael, feel free to jump in. I think around you can kill creativity. Let's imagine you're in a society, you're in a place. In some people you cannot kill it. Then, so you are stifled all the way. You've almost forgot you can be creative. You've learned not to be creative so well. It pays you so much that not to be creative. And of course, in any society, you get a few people who can never be stifled. You know, that's how I'm more thinking about politically creative individuals. I'm thinking about the dissenting voices in different contexts. So if you're stifled all the way, and then eventually you die. Eventually you will die. You know, when you're 90 or you're 100, whatever happens. Don't you think in that sense, creativity has been killed?
Let me quickly respond, and then I definitely want to open it up to our guests. So I've written about this concept that I call creative mortification, which is and can occur in an instant. It can even occur when somebody's providing what they see as somewhat helpful feedback to somebody. And what ends up happening is the person receives the message that they did something wrong. So they experience shame, which is extremely painful personal emotion, coupled with the belief that they can't get better at it. Like you'll never be the next John Keats if that's who their poetic hero is, for example. And yes, they might put down that pen for the rest of their lives. And in that case, perhaps you can make the argument kind of post hoc after they've passed that yes, it seems that it was killed. However, it's still possible to recover from those moments. It's very difficult. It's extraordinarily painful for somebody who had those kind of creative aspirations to pick that pen back up, to put back on those ballet shoes, to open that science book, to kind of persist through that. I agree. There are multiple barriers, personal and kind of sociological, that kind of get in the way of that. However, I still think I have to maintain hope as an educator that we can kind of recover from those moments. Right?
Yeah, well, recover when you have a chance to recover. But what I'm talking about, in certain societies, the chance never exists. And then at a certain point, you forget. Maybe that's where Michael and Julian come in. That's where the restoration of creativity can come in. Maybe that's where teaching is of value, to bring it back in some ways. Michael and Judy, go ahead.
Can I pick up on Ron's point? I absolutely agree. I think creativity, if we believe it's in an inherency and it's part of who we are as humans, it can't be extinguished completely ever. And you even look at some of the artwork that was coming out of the Holocaust. I mean, that it's well documented that creativity wasn't killed in those horrorscapes, in those terrible places where you would think they would be absolutely extinguished. And so my argument would be that you absolutely can't extinguish creativity because it is part of who we are. And I'd also like to pick up on Ron's point, which is, what are the circumstances in which creativity is possible in teaching? And I suppose I'd go a bit further and say that creativity can be taught because we can structure a pedagogy around it. I want to show you two examples, if I may. One comes from one of your previous guests, Bill Lucas, and one comes from some of the work we've been doing in our schools. And I'll go through it very quickly. The creativity wheel, which is Lucas, Claxton, and Spencer, and this is being worked with at Rudy Hill High School, which is up the road from us. But this
I've been there, by the way. I've been to the school many times.
Yeah, it's a great school, wonderful school, and they've been using this creativity wheel. And I kind of cite this work partly because it's not my own, but to say that there are different models of pedagogies for creativity out there. And the work we've been doing with 50 schools in partnership. So when we go into schools, we get the same kind of stuff. We hear people saying, "Oh, you can't teach creativity," or "I'm not creative," or etc., etc. And what we've been talking about is how we actually structure and think about creativity in this way, how we have a pedagogy for creativity. Now, I'm not sure whether Ron and I are actually saying the same thing or saying something different, but what I think is that you can create a pedagogy where creativity is possible by providing a structure for what a creative process looks like. Because there are well-documented creative processes which are iterative, which allow for possibility and curiosity thinking, but are disciplined in a certain way. So that's what I'd argue around how we teach, that we can teach creativity, and we must actually.
Judy, what do you think?
I'm gonna jump in. I agree, Michael. I believe that we must try to figure out and work through this puzzle, this huge generative topic. I'm also aware I'm in the room with many researchers, right? And I am the only woman in the room too. That I wanted to notice and name that, because I really believe that restoring creativity is an act of justice. It's an act of justice of helping people tap back into their what they have inherent in their humanity. And so you know, what I've encountered as my work as a practitioner is, you know, students that will come in, they have many barriers. Those are either self-imposed barriers or external barriers. Looking at who are our creative icons, how do people talk about creative people, what kind of shortcuts are we using to just describe students and people in societies and in cultures. And then sometimes there's some imagined barriers where students just come to the table and they're looking to be restored. And that's the work that we've done at Hawken. We have, I've taught 5 semesters of a course. It's an immersive course, a 3-week course on creativity for high school students. The course is called the Creative Process course because that's what we're doing. We're thinking and we're acting and trying to work together to make creativity visible. So helping students be able to name and notice how they're acting upon ideas, what kind of actions they're taking in the world, what kind of dispositions and habits of mind they're putting into play. And then with formative feedback, ongoing embedded effort to coach and help students through that process. What we found in the course is that students' creative identity, it changes. Like they'll come in at the beginning of the course and say, I'm not a creative person. We hear that all the time. We do intake interviews. They'll leave the course and say, I feel more creative. I feel like I have a plan and know what to do. So if this is a disposition, if creativity is a disposition that I'm hearing, it's everywhere. We're talking about how important it is for our students. It's an act of justice that we figure out how we invite every single student, every single learner to the table. And I think that's the most important piece of this conversation.
Judy, I think both of you, we kind of agree on one thing, I think, is that whether it can be taught or can be restored. So I think that's something we agree on. But there's another point. Okay, how do you do it? So I know our next in a segment, we'll talk about what teachers' role, but I want to raise the question to say, you know, creativity has 2 points. You know, one is that how do you help people become more creative, and how do you restore those who've lost it? You know that they may not have lost the cognitive capability for being creative, but they've lost perhaps the confidence, the motivation, and everything to do it. So I was just wondering about the power. And I think when Michael showed the Bill Lucas, you know, and that kind of thing, I'm very suspicious of traditional creativity programs. Just, you know, I think a lot of those camps programs are like that, because the more whatever you try to do, when you try to give people, this is actually from, I'm stealing this from Ron Beghetto, is about the uncertainty. Creativity is about uncertainty. Once you teach people about this, you know, which category become, which process, are we kind of constraining them again? So that's the interesting question. Ron, maybe you can jump into to talk about that, and then we can move on to next segment.
Yeah, and I want to start by thanking you, Jody, for naming all the issues, and in particular the idea that it is an act of justice. And in fact, it's, you know, Young and I are going to be co-editing a special issue we'll talk about at the end that really talks about democratizing creative educational experiences for educators, young people, and communities that typically, I mean, if you think about where creativity lives in educational environments, typically, it's typically in these very kind of privileged sealed off spaces, right? Where 10% of less students get selected into those spaces, right? So, which doesn't make sense. If creativity, if we can all agree creativity is something we all have, how come only a tiny portion of students ever get to experience that at all? And even in those spaces, they only get to experience it for part of their day, for example. So that doesn't even make sense. But the idea, so I think trying to disrupt those kinds of traditions that we've inherited and think much more broadly and think about it as an act of justice, an act of responsibility. So then how do we go about doing it? And so the concept that I like to play with is this idea of structured uncertainty. So creating within the structures, spaces and openings where we can be surprised with what students do, where they're doing things where it's not kind of a ready-made curriculum, right? So I think there are some general tools that can help us maybe push our thinking into possibility thinking and generate new ideas and so on that might work, right? Or might not. But I think it's more about tailor-made experiences that really come from the particular unique social, cultural, historical environments and the folks that are coming into those environments and really opening up. As we've talked about before on this show, creativity is really about difference, right? Pedagogies of sameness, which are alive and well in school, are the things that really kind of seal off these opportunities. So it is about creating these kind of, I would say, semi-structured experiences with uncertainty that really allow all of us to kind of be surprised by the new ways of thinking and acting that can help lead to educational outcomes, or even, they don't even have to lead to that. They have value in and of themselves, right? So these experiences can have values in and of themselves as young people start getting their own voice and are able to produce things that mean something to them and their communities, right? So I think that's where where the kind of how comes in. But I'd be interested in other people's experiences, in maybe some examples that you've worked on or involved with or have seen of the how. Like, what are some promising practices? And then we'll move into our next question here, which kind of gets at this, which is about the teacher's responsibility.
Can I just respond to that quickly? I think it's in my view, it's wrong to think of pedagogy not being able to embrace uncertainty, if that's the suggestion. I actually think pedagogy, well-designed and thoughtful pedagogy, absolutely embraces uncertainty and possibility. And I was thinking, when we were talking about uncertainty, I don't think it's a dyad, but kind of curiosity, uncertainty, possibility, all live in the same pedagogical world, in my view. So actually you can, I think, build structures, pedagogical structures, that absolutely take account of cultural background, difference, and kind of acknowledge that uncertainty needs to be part of what happens. And teachers have been using questioning to kind of provoke uncertainty in learning for years. So my view is that you can design pedagogy that absolutely does what you're talking about, Ron.
Yeah, I agree. I was just saying that the kind of prototypical inherited pedagogy is a pedagogy of sameness, right? That typically, even when we create these openings, like asking questions, they really have an ulterior motive of driving young people to an expected outcome. Not only what I expect to hear, but how I expect to hear it, right? So I think those can be kind of these false openings. That's why I think there's a lot of young people who don't trust any invitations to share their ideas, because it's really not about their ideas. It's about how well can you match what the teacher expects and how the teacher expects.
Well, there's another point before. I think we can jump on to next, but my issue is this: is because what I've been focusing on my life really, and now I'm kind of old now, but just really focus on my life is on individuality. We got millions, billions of students. So whatever works for one may not work for the other. So that's what I'm constantly fighting for, is for the individual student. Like a lot of times, if you look at quite innovative teachers, I've been watching them, most innovative teachers, they become innovative, not because they've been taught, they become innovative. And then they began to access readings to do something. Then they become leaders. It's really fascinating through that process, not because they were taught. So I think, let's move on to the next segment. My point is to say, we got to watch for, when you teach a group of 30 students, 50 students, who is an exception? Go for it.
Okay, so as I transition to this slide, I'd be interested in hearing from you, Jody, what kinds of things have, because I know you've been involved in projects that are aimed at doing this. So as before we get to that slide of the teacher responsibility, what kinds of things have you seen that are these kind of pedagogies of possibility, if you will?
Thanks. Thank you. So as I'm listening to all of you, I keep picking up on this thread that about questions, the questions that we're asking and how we might harness the power of our questions and systems. From my perspective, systems move in the direction of what we ask questions about. So I'm going to speak from just my own practice that, this experience that I've had at Hawken, which has been extraordinary. And also this experience that I've shared with many colleagues, both at Hawken and outside of Hawken. We put together with students, with teachers, a structure, a framework. This is called the SEED framework for cultivating creativity. And basically, they're questions. So the first question you ask is, how did social interactions lead to the development of this particular idea? So S is social interactions. And you can either zoom out and you can look at a creative icon and start to uncover and see the complexity of that particular person or idea. Or students can zoom in and say, okay, who did I talk to about this? Like, I'm thinking through my own lens and experience. I'm on this call with all of you, and this particular privilege of being here and learning from and with you is going to allow me to have new ideas and expand the work that I'm doing with students. So this would be a social interaction. The next kind of pathway is what I like to call it. It's like that structure that will allow creativity to thrive is experience. What personal experiences or what parts of our identity are playing out in this particular moment. For me personally, I used to sit in my living room every night with my dad reading the encyclopedias. I mean, this is what we did for fun when I was growing up, and I became really curious about the world and how things worked. And so that sense of curiosity, I think, really shows up in my work. The other two pathways, environment, like what kind of access do we have? What kind of materials do we have? What kind of technologies can we access in our environments, in our contexts? And then finally, the last pathway, this pathway of discovery. And I think we touched upon it a little bit in this conversation, is how are ideas situated in the broader scope of the social atmosphere, cultural, like the culture that we grow up, our social structures that we grow up in, like how are these ideas situated there, and how are we building off of the shoulders of people that came before us? So that's the structure that we've used with students, and we use it in a way that we either zoom out and we look at who we would typically call creative icons and examine really closely what were all the factors that led to the development of this idea or person that we now call, quote, creative. Or we zoom in and say, okay, I'm going to work on this, project is going to be tied to the UN goals, and I'm going to think through a puzzle in my own community and my own environment. And then how am I approaching that idea development through these four lenses? So that's been the how for us, examining creative icons, zooming out, and then zooming in. And we found a lot of success with that at Hawken.
Thank you. And I think that's a really nice segue to this question. So experiences like what you were describing in that SEED framework, should those be situated in some sort of specialized creativity class offered to all students in school? And this is an interesting, so we see kind of a split across here in how people responded to this. So yes, to a specialized creativity class, no is about a quarter, and then a third are somewhat ambivalent. What are your thoughts on this?
Michael, go for it. Take a spin at this response.
So I'm a hard no on this one. I don't think we should have special creativity classes, and I think that's been a problem over the years that we've put, and it's never for all, right? It's always for the gifted and talented kids. But what we know is creativity is life-wide. If you look at Anna Craft's work, it's in everything that we do, or potentially in everything that we do. So my argument is it shouldn't be specialized. It should be in every class. Every student in every subject has the right to access creativity, and not in some specialized, ghettoized way. It's a bit like saying, should we have a special collaboration class? No. Why would we have a special collaboration class? That doesn't make any sense. The creativity, in my view, only makes sense in the spaces within and between disciplines. And disciplines and areas and fields of understanding are critical to understand creativity. In fact, the structures that I showed you, Lucas's structures and our structures, don't make any sense unless there's deep disciplinary understanding or interdisciplinary understanding applied to them. Because actually, creativity without knowledge or understanding or skills is just kind of aerosol. It's fluff. And so I don't think they should be. I think creativity shouldn't be in specialized classes, it should be in all classes.
Judy?
Okay, I agree. And yes, it would be amazing if every school had access to a 3-week deep dive immersive class in creativity. That would be amazing. But I agree, Michael, that we need a pedagogy of creativity in schools, and where every single discipline is exploring creativity. If we're saying, and I'm hearing it, I'm an educator of 26 years, like all you hear is that students need creativity to be successful. Okay, so if that's what we're saying, and all students need that skill to be successful, then we need some kind of pedagogy. And I also am mindful that we have a long ways to go to get to a place where creativity is being unpacked and explored in every single discipline, that learners see creativity as multiple, that it's not just in the arts hallway, right? It's not just down like this hallway where all the creative kids hang out, but it's everywhere. That's the hope, and that's where I hope that we can end up. To get there, what I found in this work that we've been doing and engaging with in Hawken over the last 5 years is we have a creativity course. There have been so many different educators that have helped to co-teach and create and construct that course. And then what happens is those educators go back to their environments, and then they're talking about creativity, and it's across all the disciplines. And so it's starting to kind of trickle out.
So Judy, excuse me, I need to jump in there to ask you, and I know Ron has done a lot of work in the classroom, but I want to actually ask the question. This might offend a lot of people. Do you think teachers as a profession are generally told not to be creative because they have to follow the curriculum, they have to do this? So even if they try to be creative, do you think they are still not the creative group? What do you think, Judy?
Well, part of the work that I've been able to do over the last 5 years is I've been an online coach for Project Zero, and I've had the opportunity to connect with educators from around the world. And a lot of people are grappling with this question, that there are so many constraints in education, and they want, I hear from educators like, I really want to do this, but how am I supposed to do this when I have this checklist of curricular demands that I have to meet? And so, often in my coaching, I'll work with educators to say, okay, well, like just try this one thing. It's like if you teach for these dispositions and you cultivate these habits of mind in the classroom, then what I found is in that list of curriculum, it kind of gets easier to implement and to teach, but it's a huge shift. Ron talks about, a huge risk for educators to try something different and play in the messy, broad, dynamic, emergent structure of creativity. So
I was wondering, just Ron, do you think we should have specialized creativity teachers?
No, I don't. I think teachers, absolutely not. I think teachers come into the work as creative beings, and they recognize that. I agree that, however, the way they're prepared and the pressures that they face either directly and explicitly or implicitly, including some pushback from their own students, right? who, when you ask a student to come up with their own problem, a lot of savvy students are like, okay, what problem should I solve? Right? I mean, it's usually a game, right? I call it the game of intellectual hide and seek, right? Guess what I want you to do and how I want you to do it. So I think there's a lot of suspicion around all of this, right? Because I would say it's a beautiful risk to teach for and with creativity. It's extremely difficult given the structures we have and given the way in which teachers are actually taught how to design lessons. So this whole idea of backwards planning, where you design with the end in mind, so everything's driving to a predetermined fixed end, conspires against emergent to be determined outcomes, right? Because I think there's like a tyranny of the lesson plan. So what I would like to see is perhaps ways in which teachers start learning how to unstructure and unplan some of those lessons, and perhaps have specialized time to allow students to explore within their regular classroom, give them time to explore their own interests and to develop those based on, so use learning as a means to some creative end, rather than use creativity as a means to some predetermined fixed end. I think you can have both and, but I think we rarely see an opportunity for students to put any academic learning to creative ends or to creative use, to meaningful use.
Well, I think, this goes back to Michael's talk about, I want to throw in another different angle here. To me, I really don't think there should be any teaching or any instruction. I think students should all learn on their own. When they have, let's assume all students come to our kindergarten, first grade. They're live, they're creative, they want to do this. So we work with them, like the Reggio model, other models. So then they work smaller groups in pods. Nowadays we call them tiny group. Then if they have a question, they come to ask you. The teacher can encourage them, support them, guide them. So in a sense to say, I'm opposed to, all kinds of instruction with any curriculum. So just follow any topic, support a group of students. They can become extremely creative, and everything they do, they have to create some kind of solution, which we kept going. And then you can dive quite deep into that process. So I was just wondering, what's your response? Whenever I say a subject, a course that you are trying to teach 30 students, I feel very nervous, because anytime, this is from Richard Elmore's actual writing, talking about if you observe any classrooms, you got a 1/3 problem. You always get the 1/3 engaged, 1/3 pretending to be engaged, and 1/3 not engaged. So that's what you're happening about. So what do you think of that, Michael?
The issue with that, Yong, I think, is that if we don't say for instance, we don't teach kids to read and write, that disinherits them from a whole lot of cultural.
So actually, the
access.
Interesting thing, Michael. Actually, I'm going to pick you with that one. Do you actually teach people to read? Okay, you don't teach people to read. I think they learn to read with or without a teacher. Sometimes some students will need some instruction. Most kids learn to read really on their own. Would you think?
Well, no, I don't agree, and Freire wouldn't agree either. I mean, Freire, kind of one of the major progressives, actually wasn't about just letting kids do what they want. It's actually giving them access to the tools of creation, and this actually comes back to why creativity matters in the classroom. We teach kids to read and write because our culture says that's important, and we don't teach them about creative process, which I think is as important, in my view, as reading and writing. And I think the problem with saying, oh well, we shouldn't actually engage with teaching, it's because in a sense, the kind of teaching you're suggesting, Yong, that we shouldn't be doing, I agree with you. The kind of direct instruction is only one small part of what education should be. The encouragement, the facilitation, that's pedagogy as well. In fact, in our work, we've identified 9 pedagogical elements that are part of the whole way we should be doing education and learning, and yet we focus often on some very narrow ways of doing things. And I think,
but I'm reading your book, which it's pretty good. So thank you. Yeah,
they're very nice of you to say so. I want to take up something Jody said as well. We often get teachers saying to us, "Oh, this is hard and that's hard," and of course that's absolutely true. But creativity actually thrives in constraint often. It's actually through constraint that we can be creative often. And I'm not denying for one moment that teachers are under pressure. They have so many competing demands. I mean, I've been in the classroom. I've been facing those demands as well. But actually, I think constraint is not a reason not to be creative. It's actually a reason to be creative in the way we think about pedagogy, curriculum, the whole thing. So I think actually, to Yong's point, we've got to unlearn some of those terrible and restrictive pedagogies that don't allow for possibility and uncertainty, and open up possibility through really kind of generative teaching that embraces some of the things you're talking about.
Ron, I want to bring you in because you actually have really did a lot of research in the classroom about how teachers can what they call kill creativity softly. No, you don't never use that word. How do you lose creativity?
Killing ideas softly, yeah.
Yeah.
So I think I think your comments, Young, are somewhat provocative about there should be no teaching. And I want to hear Jody's comments on this as well, because she's actively teaching, right? So, I mean, I agree that, okay, look, in my most glib moments, I will admit that, look, teachers need students to teach. Students do not always need teachers to learn. That is a fact. I don't think we can accept
Thank you.
that.
That's say that again. Repeat that. That's a really powerful statement. Repeat that. Seriously,
Okay,
repeat that.
Okay, so yes, teachers absolutely need students to teach, but students don't always, and I'm putting the qualifier always, need teachers to learn. They sometimes do, though, however, right? And so I think
they often do.
So I think it's when, and I agree that they need access skills, right? So, and I think there's efficient ways to provide them with things so they don't have to reinvent like how to teach themselves to read or write or something like that, that they have these kind of access skills. But I think we spend way too much time kind of teaching them things that they probably don't need to be taught by a teacher, or in the way it's taught, that they could come across that by doing meaningful work where they realize, I need to know more about this. And a teacher could play a different role and connect them with assets in their own families, communities, the broader world, right, of experts and experiences that can help these young people kind of accomplish the goals that they have in the world. And that's what I call kind of a beautiful risk. It's about not just doing something that might not work for yourself and benefit yourself, but actually has the opportunity to make a positive and lasting contribution to others. And so I think if we thought about that as kind of a design principle in teaching, then it kind of shifts the role of what is the teacher's role in that, because we can't anticipate what students are actually going to be working on, but we can, as teachers, connect them with the resources and sometimes through direct instruction too, the instruction that they need to accomplish those goals. So that's, again, using education as a means to some other end rather than as an end in of itself. I mean, that's the most infuriating thing. Like, why do I have to learn how to solve this algebraic equation? Because you need to learn how to solve algebraic questions. You need to know how to do this. Why? Right? It's a circular argument. You learn this so that you've learned it. That's not compelling to anyone, even the third that are paying attention, right? But Jody, I'm going to stop talking. I want to hear your thoughts on this.
Okay. There are a couple things coming up for me as a practitioner in the classroom for 26 years and a mom of a 16 and 17-year-old that are growing up in school, in our world. And the first is there's a power structure. I think that's kind of hidden here, where students come in and the teacher has the power and they're filling up the minds of the students. And so I think this is an issue of turning that power structure on its head, like just turning it upside down. And instead of the teacher coming in and trying to, fill the kids with knowledge and content, that we practice our curiosity and try to figure out, like, what is it that the students are curious about? How are they thinking? How is that thinking made visible? So that's something that's coming up for me. And I think, watching my children grow up, my own children grow up, watching lots of students go through school. They're online knowledge sourcing. They're learning things that they want to learn on their own. They're using technology, finding a way as a teacher, and I'm thinking about this all the time in my own practice. How do I step back and let my students step up and teach each other, that students can show up as teachers. So there are multiple ways for students to access content and learning in the age that we're in. And so that's something that I'm thinking about as I'm listening to you. And I also wanted to add that when we're, this is kind of going backwards a little bit to this question of like specialized creativity courses. People call that the arts, right? That's actually happening. And this is, as somebody that has taught in the arts and I care deeply and I'm very passionate about the arts, I really want to see that open, that access and that opportunity to explore something and explore uncertainty in a structured way. I want to see that for everybody, right? That's why I've entered into this work. I'm like, how do we push this conversation beyond the arts? When you create a piece of theater, you know where you're going, but there's all kinds of twists and turns to get there to the end of that piece. So I think we can learn a lot about the dispositions of creativity and the habits of mind of creativity by turning to the arts and examining those things, and then bringing more artful practices into all other areas of education.
Jody, I just want to add that I think I love your comment about the power relationship, because adults, in essence, parents and teachers, do control rewards. We control resources. We can decide for young children where to go. I mean, in our schools, I'm sure you've run into this. Once kids get to the age they can rebel, they do kind of rebel. And some kids do, but not all of them. Or they quiet and rebel. You notice that, right? They kind of pretend they were doing something, but they were not doing that, or you may not know. So, but I just want to add one point before Ron brings out the last segment, is that my argument is for students to allow them to take control, to co-develop their school pathway in life. I think now it's actually more possible because you were talking about technology and in collaboration. I just have a hard time with today in the 21st century. I don't know, we're 2 decades into this now. All the resources kids have, all the different possibilities they have. So why would they be still limited by a curriculum? I mean, a curriculum framework. And you guys, your Hawken doesn't need one, but think about the public schools, the massive number of students. That's one concern I really have, to say, why can't they design and pursue their own pathway? Because it is true. You cannot be good at everything now. It's impossible. I think, Michael, reading and writing, the basic this stuff might be needed, but how much the basis and how much can they learn on their own? There another point I think is really what Ryan, I think, I just love the story you tell me about how a teacher can really quickly make you not interested in being creative. That's really something. It's this is a backstory we had before. They can make you very creative. They can encourage you, but they may not encourage you. And also because creativity is almost in every domain. Because for me, I'm not. I grew up in a little Chinese village, never had access to art. So I always admired art people, but I know nothing about art, so that's what. So, when I heard people talking about, oh, creativity belongs to art, I said, really? So I've always thought creativity is in every domain, in every place. But Ron, go ahead with our next segment before we.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I just want to echo just a couple of things. I think we have a moment now where schools have been empty, right, because of the pandemic, to rethink how those spaces could be used. Because I think part of the problem is in the way people thought about, let's just turn kids loose on their learning, is a lot of kids don't have access, right? There's not equitable distribution of access, even just an internet access, right? So what if schools were used as spaces of access where they could access resources, right? And those are in communities already, right? So those could be points of access. And I think so repurposing some of those things, I think could be really powerful. And then kind of helping teachers kind of reimagine their role again. So I think this leads us to our final question. And we have about 10 minutes to explore it. This has been a lively conversation, which is great. So let's dive into this last question and hear folks respond to it. So it's, do teachers know how to support student creativity in their classrooms? So this is the most ambivalent response we got, with 2/3 of the folks saying maybe, and then 1/4 saying no, and a tiny slice saying yes. What do you all think of that?
Yeah, well, actually, Michael and Judy, you are in the field. You run into a lot of teachers. What do you think? Do you think that's accurate?
I think yes and no. That's why there's ambivalence. I think if you said, do some teachers know how to teach creativity, we'd say absolutely yes, they do. But again, it comes back to not having access to pedagogies of creativity, not being provided with the support. And I slate this home to our systems, who are telling us, we call this the policy pedagogy gap. There's policy endlessly about how creativity matters. And then when you get down to the school level, it's all kind of, there's no support. And so I think we're at a moment, and I completely agree with Ron around the access, how we rethink schools to make them places where creativity isn't just something that the rich kids do, or we give the really bad kids because that'll keep them occupied. It's actually a basic human right. I think that's going to be the moment when we start to actually see real change in schools. But we need to support teachers pedagogically, curriculum-wise, and across the board. And this matters to me. And I take a slightly, I suppose, more less constrained view of curriculum. I think curriculum matters because it gives us access to the institutions of power, and it gives us access to the discourses of power. So I actually think a curriculum is important so that our young people know what's out there in history and mathematics and music, and then can make their own choices based on that. So yeah.
So what I'm thinking about right now is teachers were students and parents were students once, and their creativity was either cultivated or it was shut down. And so this to me, this is a big issue of restoring creativity for everyone, how we're talking about creativity, how we're naming it with students. And I just think that is like that's a really important piece in all of this, is that we have to start really with the adult community. The adults model and they honor, they name the things that and live out the things that are important, the habits of mind, the dispositions. And our students are watching us. I find it to be an incredible calling to be a teacher, especially right now. They're watching us. They're looking to us and looking for the cues, even if it looks like they might be checked out. I want to believe that they're watching. And so I think that this conversation does start with the educators, with parents, in the adult community, and just trying to shift again some of those power structures so that we move away from this creativity that separates people into categories like, oh, there's all the creative people, and move towards a creativity that really empowers everyone, that everybody feels like they have the opportunity to make our very complicated, challenged world better. Like that's my hope as an educator, and I think it starts with the teachers.
So my view, here's something I'm thinking about. I'm not against teachers, by the way. I love teachers. So we prepare teachers. We make a living preparing teachers. That's what schools of education do. But I was wondering, if that diagram, remember this is just random people would just put in their views on there. If it's right, if it's 11% or 15%, let's make 30% of teachers. That's a lot, based on that. Who knows how to do creative things, how to help students to become creative. And then we try to to teacher development. I think Michael and Judy and Ron, we've been doing teacher professional development for a long time. We always argue we need to get better teachers, better teachers. When do they arrive? So I'm always to say, okay, but we have millions of students in our classrooms, in our schools today. So what I'm really looking for, can you guys make suggestions? What can we do to create options for those students? For me, it's really online, just to say, kids just drop out, go do something else if they are, and they can access something different. Because I'm just thinking about, we may not have time to prepare all the teachers. You know how slow it is to change teachers, to do all this work. Around, I was just thinking about what you're thinking. Don't forget to talk about democratizing education. Okay, before.
Yeah,
your comments.
I'll throw that over to you. But yeah, I think I just want to kind of echo some of Jody's comments, because I focus on the teacher as well. And all teachers are doing creative things in their classrooms. They're maybe just not naming it. And students are doing creative things and they're maybe not naming it because they just haven't had the opportunity to do so. And I think the other thing that conspires against this kind of work is, we've heard about how teachers' work is so siloed, right? So why can't we leverage? So what if, how about this? Here's a suggestion. What if we leveraged all these technologies and empowered and expected all of us who teach to start naming those practices and sharing them out, curating them, showing what's being done, right? So it's not about kind of getting a completely new workforce in place. It's not about training up in a different way. It's about starting with what's already happening and then kind of leveraging that and letting that, shining the light on that. And then those practices can be reinforced. They could be seen that they're valuable. It can increase confidence. And I think it would increase creative risk-taking where people are saying, wow, I could do that too. I could do that too. It's just a small little move. And that I think could lead to big changes. So I would start there rather than, shut down schools or just say, drop out of school or let's clear out the workforce. I think we can start with what's already happening, which is often very creative, but it's kind of punctuated moments of creativity that often are just disappear. Right.
That's not enough though, Ron, right? I mean, so I'm thinking
no, it's not enough. It's just stop. Yeah. It's a baby step.
So I'm always, because I always worry about kids in poor countries too. Like, let's develop the teachers. I'm always saying, okay, we have kids passing through in front of us, millions of them. And how do we, I'm not against invest in kind of getting teachers, elevating teachers, do all of those. But at the same time, recognizing we have lots of kids in our system. So what can we do as a system, at least to help those kids who may not be fortunate enough to have a good creative teacher? So that's what my point.
Let's do a yes and do power round. We have a power comments. Let's everyone go around.
Yeah, so here's my power comment. Respectfully, Yong, I completely disagree with you about teachers changing. In this pandemic, teachers have changed almost overnight. So you give them the resources, you give them the impetus, you give them the problem, they will respond, because they're, as you know, there are amazing teachers in our system. There are fantastic students. We have the resources to do it. We absolutely do. And we see it in our 50 schools every day. And it's part of the problem is because we have been doing professional development, but you and I and many of us do this thing where we swing in for a day, we talk about creativity, everyone thinks it's wonderful, and then we disappear. I think we've got to find a new model. We've got to find a model for professional learning that walks alongside teachers, that helps them. That's what we do in our partnership schools. And that's where the change happens in relationship over the long term. And I think we can do that at scale.
Okay, Jody, you have the final word.
I do. Thank you. We're at a really incredible moment in education right now. And what I'm noticing is that teachers are sharing practices across disciplines and in ways that I haven't seen before. And I think when you talk about systems, the first piece is, naming, noticing, and really trying to uncover all the complexity that's in that system and starting there, rather than trying to fix the system, naming and noticing what's happening and how that system is changing in our current context. I have great hope for educators in what I'm seeing out there. My husband's a teacher too. He's in a public school setting, and it's really extraordinary what teachers are doing, and they're creating new solutions to problems that don't have answers in heroic ways. So I have a lot of hope for this conversation, and we got to take it one thing at a time, one day at a time.
Thank you. Young, final comment.
I just want to
summarize.
I've learned a lot. I'm so happy you guys have so much faith in the system, and I'm very glad that I threw some ideas that you have a good response. I think we should have the conversation more in the future. There's a lot to talk about, about our assessment and our teachers. So congratulations, both Judy and Michael, for doing wonderful work. I think we need a lot more of people like you. So Ron, go ahead, talk about the
Yes. So thank you both.
Okay.
Yeah, I think this has been a very provocative and important conversation. So thank you both. And I hope people watching it have been inspired and continue the conversation. We'll drop a link on a project that Young and I are doing in the kind of description of the setting, on a proposal for democratizing creative educational experiences in educational settings broadly defined. Michael and Jody, I'd also encourage you to drop us a line, and we can add it to the show notes as well if there's anything you want to point our viewers to in some of the work that you're both doing. Thank you both so much for joining us. This has been a fun conversation. Time just flew by. So have a good evening, Jody. Have a good morning, Michael. Young, I'll see you in a month.
Thank you guys. Well, watch us next month. You guys have done wonderful work.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thanks very much.